time here. So this paper was involved, and a lot of you who know my work know that I spent 4 years and actually 100 visits to a maximum security prison, working with a number of men, primarily men of color, who had been subjected to 20, 30, 40, or even more years of incarceration. And I worked with about 75 men over that period of time. But I went in there primarily to teach them, but I noted that once we got in there, there was a great research environment. And so so the institution allowed us to do research in there, which was very rare for them, associated with courses. The Gramercy gentlemen are the name of the people that I worked with. We wanted to give them some kind of moniker. And the other person is a philosophy student I had been working with. So it looks like it's up now. I just want to take a moment to talk about dehumanization and restriction inside this particular space. I had been in places before, and I'd worked in other institutions where people had been dehumanized, and I'd done work in communities where people felt dehumanized. But this was a very different space for me. In part because it involved me going there, over and over again over the course of years, but a different space for me because the institution itself held these people very, very close. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes going over each of the slides. Let's move to the next slide if we can. I know, I'm sure that, well, many of you aren't as old as me, but I remember Eisenhower talking about the military-industrial complex, and there's also a complementary term of the prison-industrial complex. I think the most important thing for you to realize is that an enormous amount of things that impact these men and women that they can consume and where they live and what they do is determined by people other than themselves. Now, you can kind of understand that. You would say, well, we don't want them to be able to get anything they want because they are being imprisoned. But I'm talking about basic things that people might want, like the food that they consume, the things that are in the commissary we have to pay extra for. And it's amazing to see how that money comes in and gets diverted to other parts of the space so that different quarters are able to get some kind of gains out of it. So a good example is in the commissary, they have one or two providers. I think there's one primary provider. They bring all kinds of things together. The men pay what I think are outrageous prices for it, even though they make between 21 and 49 cents an hour, at least when I was there. And they'll say things like, why do we get the same two kinds of Pop-Tarts? Well, they're sending requests in all the time, but nothing happens with it. But some portion of that largesse goes in to support the COs and the guards. And a lot of the money that comes off of it goes to support other aspects of the prison industrial complex. So the important thing to realize here is while these men are being held by the state, the monies that they do bring into the system are being used for other purposes. This is a total institution. There's nothing that they can do that people can't see. There's nothing that they can do that can't be observed either in that particular moment or at other particular moments, and I'm including virtually everything that they do. There are no stalls in there if anybody wants privacy when they're using a bathroom. There's no place where they can put anything that can be kept safe from other individuals. So it's a total institution in the sense of what we've talked about before. Consumption is really the battleground, though, and it was really an amazing thing to see how people would try to consume some things that gave them their sense of identity in a previous context, and then how they tried to use some things that they were required to do and try to create a different visual image of it. So for example, you're going to wear the prison browns, you have to wear the prison browns, or the different colors depending upon who you are and why you were there and how long you were there. But I found it really amazing to see that some had creases in them, or some had other kinds of ways that they try to ornament them or shift them. And it was a matter of prestige, even within that particular context, to be able to shift what you're wearing just enough to show some kind of distinction. And then there are other things too, things that take you away, like alcohol and drugs. But the other thing that was interesting is how people tried to reinvent things on the outside. Remember, most of these men came from Philadelphia. And so I remember Omar told me one time, he said that the best cheesesteak I've ever had was in prison. the reason why we called them the Gramercy Gentlemen is because they were being dehumanized. One of the things we wanted to do was not to let people decide who they were. A lot of the men would say, you know, the 15 seconds that this particular event occurred has defined me for the last 40 years, and I've been trying for 40 years to try to be different. People would come into the prison when I was teaching or working with people and just call out numbers, you know, like R57364. And I used to say to them, we don't go by numbers in here, we go by names, which really was not a smart thing to do around COs. But at any rate, we decided to refer to ourselves as a Gramercy Gentleman because what we wanted to do is to be able to say we're aspiring to a sense of identity that might be different. Could you go to the next slide, please, so that we can move this on? You know, I would say that the men in and of themselves, this was a mortification of the self and status reduction. And the vast majority of the men I came in contact with, I can actually say there's only one that I think might be different than that, came from impoverished backgrounds. And so you would say, well, if you're going from poverty into this environment, it's a step, but it's not as big a step down. The two things that occur, one is that some of them had risen to the higher socioeconomic ranks within their communities, sometimes by selling drugs and other kinds of things. But in every case, they had a sense of identity and being, you know, brother, a husband, a father, a son, etc., because it's all male. And they had been denuded of all of that. In fact, there was very little from their past they were able to take with them. In some cases, the only thing they could use to store personal possessions was a box. And I can't remember the dimensions of a box, but just think about when you've moved and take one of those smaller boxes that you use to stack things in, and everything that you wanted that was private over the course of 20 or 40 years had to be contained within that box. So they lost lots of things that gave them their sense of identity previously, and it was a mortification. The severe restrictions are interesting. You know, if we had all day, we could talk about some of them. But one thing I wanted to bring up here is that the system allows it to open up a little bit sometimes, and then it closes down on top of it, and open up a little bit, and then it closes down on top of it. In other words, they know that there's contraband in there, but they allow it to happen because it's one of the tension valves they use, particularly around the holidays, to allow people to have more things and to have more opportunities so that it brings down the anxiety and kind of the anger that goes on and the frustration that goes on in these environments. And then it'll clamp down on it. Okay. So it wants to keep it under control, but it also realizes that there may be 300 to 400 employees there and 4,000 men. If those men rebelled against them, something could happen. We did talk about rebirth and redefinition. It was amazing to see people go through college courses, start graduate school, start tutoring people inside, start charities inside and outside this space, and then begin trying to reconnect with the outside in ways that were exciting. I'm only going to just show you this. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's in the paper if you get a chance to go to JACR, and I want to thank the people at JACR, particularly Linda Price, for all the help she gave us in making this a good paper. But I also want to thank the editors there too, the current editors. They've been very responsive to seeing one of their papers in this reward. I just want to finish by saying, you know, this system is built on suppliers take money out. Okay, money comes in, you see that down in the right-hand corner, but a lot of the money we're talking about, there is federal money that comes in, but a lot of the money that comes in from this particular space, we're talking about money from families and friends, which tends to dry up over time. Um, there are outflows, there's a lot of outflows here, but the only other outflow is men. There has to be a continuous influx of men. And when I had a student who drew this for me, I wanted to make sure that you recognize it had a face of color because it has a face of color. But what's interesting, the government has lots of businesses they're running on the inside. They're giving them 20 to 30 hours a week of work because they don't want to have to pay benefits if they got beyond a certain level. And they're paying them 21 to 49 cents an hour for work that actually leads to the ability to sell things, you know, at other prices. So this was it was a really incredible space. Some of you have met some of the men, at least at TCR. We met one of them. I've continued to interact with these men, even though I've been gone since 2016. And we've been able to go to court for them and try to get them out of prison. The one thing that I told these men, since they're primarily people of color, that if a white-faced professor can come in and help your cause, you let me know and I'll be there. And so there are a couple of us who've been involved in this program that would go regularly to whenever they had hearings. And we've gotten several, probably 6 men are out of that place. I'm not saying because we did it, we were only part of it, but this was the part of the advocacy that I thought was important. And thank you so much for listening. Thanks for letting me present my ideas today.
Ron, thank you as always for sharing a very humbling and motivating research with us. I don't know if there are any questions per se. Len, I saw that your video is up. Did you have a question for Ron? Okay. Okay. So Ron, one quick question I had for you, because we want to get to our final presentation, is that, you've used a participatory research approach that you mentioned, you talk about in more detail in your paper. And I wondered, in terms of this participatory approach, can you share with us some of the key challenges in using that in this context?
Yeah, so a couple of challenges is you think it's hard to get out of prison. It's often hard to get into prison. It's to be able to come in and to be able to meet with these men in private context in which I was able to do it is not as simple as it might sound. There are lots of people come in and out of prison, but they're highly watched. They're watched because there's a lot of issues with contraband, and there's also the belief that if you're coming in on behalf of prisoners, that you're probably as guilty as them. And so there were lots of times that I got treated really poorly by COs and other people because they didn't like the fact that I was coming in and trying to educate men way beyond in which the COs were being educated or provide support for them. So that's one. The second is it's a matter of gaining trust. One thing I can say about many of the men in there is they're looking for allies because they lose allies over time as people die, move off. They can't pay lawyers any longer. So they're looking for people that can help them. On the other hand, they have this distrust. And I think as one person said to me, everybody that screwed me over was white. And I said, and so I looked at him and I said, same thing is true of me. And it was true of me, of course. But